Hi, this is going to be a short PowerPoint on how to complete the DNA submission form for the Johnson County Crime Lab and hopefully some answers to some frequently asked questions that we commonly get here in the lab. For those of you that have already been using our DNA submission form, we have recently changed the form. Hopefully this new form will be a little bit easier to understand. We've limited the number of questions that we've asked, and we've taken away a lot of the boxes that we required additional information to be typed into. So hopefully this form, you'll like it, and if you haven't used the form at all, then you won't know the difference. We've also tried to make it less duplication of information from the current laboratory submission sheet. And also we've added some fields that are in red, which will provide some information to some of our frequently asked questions and help you understand why you are answering these questions for us. Just to give you a little bit of background on why we actually have a separate form for DNA submissions or DNA evidence, the main reason is because when we work a case, if we don't have a suspect to compare to or someone to match the evidence to, we always like to put that evidence into our DNA database or CODIS. And the FBI governs CODIS with very strict rules on what kinds of samples can actually be uploaded into the National CODIS database. So what we're trying to do with this form is make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row and know that the sample being uploaded is allowed at the FBI and that it is the kind of sample that we are supposed to be putting in. Secondly, there's just not enough space on the original laboratory submission form, so we had to create a second form. And then lastly, the DNA section has a very large backlog currently, and we're trying to make this process a little bit more streamlined to be able to accept the best cases at this time and possibly go back and work some of those that we were not able to accept at a later time when our backlog is under control. So to start out with the new DNA submission form, I'm just going to highlight some different areas and tell you a little bit about how to go about filling that out or what exactly that means. So this first part is just some introductory information on the top. That is very important. And what that says in a nutshell is that whenever evidence is submitted for DNA analysis, we need this form completely filled out. And your evidence will be rejected just on the basis of this form not being filled out. So please make sure that that is done and that it's filled out completely. Also, as part of this information, we've said that on the laboratory submission form, there is an area at the bottom to provide a brief case synopsis, and that is required whenever DNA is required on that piece of evidence. So that also needs to be completely filled out on the laboratory submission form for a case to be accepted for DNA analysis. And really that just comes down to we need to know case circumstances so we know how to proceed with the case and so that we know what kind of evidence we're dealing with so we can appropriately determine if that evidence can be put into the DNA database. This next section is simply the agency case information. So just which agency and the agency case number. This information is duplicated from the laboratory submission form, but that is so we can identify this form back to a case if necessary. Also, there will be a place at the bottom of the form to add the agency item numbers, and that also will be a duplication, but that should be the only area where information is duplicated from the laboratory submission form. This next section is very important. This is where we are asking what type of biological samples are being submitted as evidence. So if you'll just look at the examples that we have or the types of samples we have, blood and semen are pretty self-explanatory. Perspiration is going to be anything that somebody would have sweated on or worn. So these are things like clothing, hats, gloves, sunglasses, things like that. The next one is saliva, and this is anything that would have come in contact with somebody's mouth. So gum, cigarette butts, bottles or cans, envelope seals, things of that nature. We have also have a box for any known DNA sample that comes into the lab. And on this, we would like you to indicate whether that is the suspect or a victim or some other kind of elimination sample, such as an owner of a business or something along those lines. And the last box is going to be our touch surfaces. And this is everything, either an item or a swab from an item that you think the perpetrator touched. And it doesn't involve any of the previous categories like perspiration or saliva. So this will be something like a swab from a steering wheel from a stolen car, or a screwdriver left at the scene of a crime. So if you just fill out and select all that apply, so if you're submitting 10 different pieces of evidence, select any and all that apply to that case. So that way we know what kind of samples they're coming in. The next section is asking whether a DNA sample has been collected from the suspect and submitted to the laboratory. And then the three possible answers for this are yes, no, or the suspect is unknown at this time. So if you don't have a suspect, just check that last box. The reason we ask for a suspect known DNA sample is for ease of comparing to a case if a suspect is known. There's a lot of misconception that the DNA sample collected from a person upon arrest in the jail comes to our lab, and that is not correct. That sample goes to the KBI and is used solely for the DNA database for the convicted offender part of that database. We don't have access to it, and we cannot ask the KBI to send us that sample. So if you want a suspect compared to the evidence, we will need a new DNA sample collected from that suspect for comparison. Also, something to keep in mind is that any case that is a drug possession or a felon in possession of a firearm case, so any case where somebody had possession of an item, those samples cannot be put into CODIS, and therefore we must have a suspect known to work those cases. If you submit to DNA one of those two types of cases, drug possession or felon in possession of a firearm, and we do not have a suspect DNA sample submitted at the same time or previously, then that case will be rejected for DNA analysis. So that's just something to keep in mind. The next section here, question number 3, is for special case circumstances. And this is really important when we have property crimes that only have that touch kind of evidence and there's no suspect known provided. We need those cases to meet one of these 3 criteria to be able to be accepted into the laboratory. This is solely for reducing our backlog and trying to work the most important cases that we can, and so that we're able to get to cases. So please mark if one of those applies to your case. If one of these ends up applying at a later date, or a suspect becomes available at a later date and a known is available, then you can always resubmit these cases that get turned back to your agency. The fourth question on here is whether there are elimination samples from the victim or any other involved party that have been collected and submitted for this case. And the property crimes that met the criteria on the last question, any item that comes from that kind of case that could have reasonably been touched by the victim or any other elimination person needs to have their known DNA submitted to the lab for us to be able to work those samples. So an example of an item that would meet that criteria is a swab of a steering wheel from a stolen car. So somebody gets their car stolen, swab is taken from the steering wheel to try to see if the suspect DNA is on it, but a suspect is not known at that time. Since it's very likely that the victim's DNA is on their own steering wheel, we need to get a victim DNA sample so that we can eliminate them as having donated the DNA on the steering wheel and therefore put a good profile into CODIS. The same would go for if a business was burglarized, maybe a safe from the business. We would need elimination samples from anybody that could have had access to that safe and that their DNA might be on that safe so we can eliminate them. Any item that is simply left by the perpetrator, like a tool, a screwdriver, a duffel bag, that the victim could not have touched or said they did not touch, then we can work those without victim DNA samples. Also, if a known sample from the suspect has previously been submitted, then we also do not need the victim's knowns in that case. Finally, we have this table at the end that has a couple of different columns that need to be filled out. The first is for the agency item number, and the second is for priority of analysis. So we'd like you to put in order which items you think are the most important, which ones you would like to see worked first, second, third, etc. The next column is a question of, is the evidence that you've submitted foreign to the scene or to the victim? And this means, was it left at the scene by the perpetrator? Pretty much if a victim could have touched the item, such as the steering wheel example, previously, then the answer to this question should be no, because that evidence is not foreign to the victim. It's likely the victim's DNA is on there. So the answers are yes, no, or unknown to this column. And then finally, we have an area where you can include additional description of the item. Sometimes we get samples that come in and all the submission form says is swabs or swabs from vehicle. And we would actually like to know a little bit more detail on what items were actually swabbed. If you have a swabs from the vehicle, is it from a steering wheel and a gear shift, or is it from a Pepsi can that was left in the stolen auto? So these things are very important in us being able to determine whether we can work the case and what kind of priority the case is going to get. Ultimately, if you have any questions regarding this form, feel free to call us here at the laboratory, 826-3209, and you can speak with anybody in the property room or in the biology DNA section. Thank you.